We've heard from Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier, saying that Donald Trump could pull the rug out from underneath NAFTA or CUSMA, USMCA, whatever you want to call it, as soon as November.
No, Canada pulled out the rug from USMCA. He got that fact wrong. Or, he didn't, he doesn't realize this or that.
The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement wasn't meant to face its first big test until 2026. That's when all three partners decide whether to extend it for another 16 years. But well ahead of that date, the pact is already caught in a political storm. Warnings from Canadian leaders about an early reopening have met with pointed pushback from Washington, which accuses Ottawa of undermining the deal. Instead of serving as a stable base for North American trade, USMCA is being pulled into the high-pressure arena of tariff politics. The question now is whether this is tactical posturing or the opening move in a reshaping of the continent's commerce.
The biggest U.S. complaint is the fact Canada retaliated at all. That harsh retaliation counter tariffs on things like orange juice, motorcycles, and appliances, goods that have been covered under the Canada-US-Mexico free trade deal, a move that has seriously upset the Americans.
From the White House view, USMCA is fair game. President Trump's team says every agreement is subject to review if it stops serving U.S. interests. Their chief complaint: Canada's retaliatory tariffs on goods that should be duty-free under USMCA. U.S. officials say that puts the pact itself in doubt.
We're starting to get closer and closer to the point where the president will want to reopen negotiations on USMCA. And I think that poses a bit of a risk.
So far, Washington has kept exemptions for Canadian goods meeting USMCA rules of origin. Losing those protections would pull a much larger share of trade into the tariff net, on top of the 35% already applied to Canadian exports outside the pact. According to Statistics Canada, 80 to 85% of Canada's exports to the U.S. now qualify for duty-free treatment. Removing that shield would raise costs on both sides, but it would also give Trump another powerful lever, just as he used with the EU, Japan, and South Korea to extract tariff caps and investment pledges. Ottawa is not approaching this from a position of retreat. Prime Minister Mark Carney's strategy has been one of strategic patience, avoiding rushed concessions while keeping communication channels open. At the same time, Canada is preparing the ground. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's public warnings about USMCA have been aimed as much at U.S. audiences as Canadian ones, highlighting the potential costs for American consumers and manufacturers if tariff walls go up. Policy steps are equally deliberate. Federal and provincial leaders are working to increase the share of exports that meet USMCA rules, ensuring that the majority of trade remains shielded. Canada is also deepening partnerships with Mexico, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, building alternate routes for trade in case U.S. market access narrows. And it holds serious bargaining chips. Canada is America's top foreign supplier of crude oil, natural gas, and electricity, and a key source of uranium and critical minerals for electric vehicles and semiconductors. In North America's integrated auto sector, these resources are not easily replaced without disrupting supply chains on both sides of the border. Under USMCA's review clause, a refusal to extend the deal in 2026 triggers annual reviews and the risk of expiry in 2036. Trump could push that process earlier by tying USMCA renewal to stalled Canada-US talks, widening the scope for concessions. Canada has options. One is a tariff cap similar to the 15% ceilings the U.S. granted the EU, Japan, and South Korea. Another is to strengthen non-U.S. trade alliances to offset American pressure. And given U.S. dependence on Canadian energy and industrial inputs, Ottawa can use that interdependence to protect key sectors. USMCA's early arrival in the political crossfire shows how fragile even modern trade pacts can be when national strategies shift. Trump is willing to make the deal part of his tariff-driven approach. Canada, under Carney, is countering with preparation, diversification, and strategic leverage. The months ahead will decide if the tension produces a workable arrangement or turns 2026 into a flashpoint for a bigger confrontation. Either way, the outcome will shape not just tariff rates, but the balance of economic power in North America for years to come.
This guy's coming at us. I just want to go on record. He's coming full bore at us. We got to move quicker, and folks, be ready. He's not waiting till 2026. At any given time, President Trump, he could pull the carpet out from underneath us on Kuzma tomorrow with one signature.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford didn't mince words. In a press conference that cut through political nuance, he warned that President Trump could end the CUSMA trade agreement, not in 2026 as expected, but as early as November 2025. And he may not even follow a formal process. All it could take is one signature. Ford called on Canadians to brace themselves. This wasn't a normal trade dispute, he said. It's something far more volatile. Coming from a provincial leader with strong ties to business and conservative circles, the message landed with weight. The concern is not hypothetical. Ford isn't just worried about tariffs. He's worried about USMCA itself, the legal backbone of North American trade.
Almost every country in the world that's trying to negotiate with this administration, it's very challenging. You think you're getting close to a deal, and then the cheese slips off the cracker when it gets to the president's desk. So, look, I think Ford's right.
That concern is echoed at the national level. Conservative strategist Corey Tanaki said it plainly. The worst may still be ahead. Trump's approach isn't rooted in conventional trade norms. He's abandoned negotiation frameworks, rejected predictability, and applied pressure without offering a path to resolution. The 35% tariffs imposed on Canada under the IEEPA are just one example. The deal-making process now moves according to Trump's timeline and his mood. It's not just Ford who's lost trust. There's growing doubt across Canada's leadership that any deal with this U.S. administration can be relied on. After all, Trump is threatening to override agreements he once championed. CUSMA itself was signed under his presidency.
Canada and Mexico themselves have about $50 billion in two-way trade, so that's nothing to sneeze at. It's highly unpredictable, and so both sides need to sort of get together and figure out what the hell's going on.
While Trump escalates, Canada and Mexico are recalibrating. This week, Canada's foreign affairs and finance ministers traveled to Mexico for high-level talks. The agenda wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. Trade officials and business leaders from both countries sat down to align supply chain goals, discuss trade infrastructure, and build a united response to what one expert called a toxic atmosphere. Both Canada and Mexico are being hit with emergency tariffs, though Mexico was granted a 90-day pause. Yet the message is clear. Neither country trusts the current state of U.S. trade policy. In place of that trust, they're forming their own foundation, one grounded in mutual reliability, not coercion. But building that foundation takes time, and time is exactly what the markets may not have. On July 31st, the U.S. Court of Appeals reviewed the legality of Trump's emergency tariffs. Lower courts had ruled against them, but let them proceed, citing ongoing talks with China. If courts strike them down, Canada might be better off waiting than rushing into a bad deal. Ottawa now faces a dilemma. Take a risky agreement or wait for legal clarity that may never come.
We can either wring our hands and lament the fact that the U.S. administration is doing this, or we can get to work on building our own economy by getting started on projects that frankly should have been done 20 years ago.
Inside Canada, the message is starting to sink in. Yes, provinces have different priorities. Alberta wants to protect oil, Ontario its auto and steel industries, and Quebec its aluminum. But Ford noted that 98% of what's needed is shared. The divisions are shrinking. The urgency is growing. Large-scale national infrastructure projects, long stalled, are being revisited as a way to build internal economic strength and reduce dependence on unpredictable trade flows. It's not just about defending sectors anymore. It's about defending sovereignty. Trump couldn't force Canada to fold with tariffs. And now, facing a firm but calm Canadian government, he may try something else, dismantling the agreement entirely. Ford's warning was blunt because the stakes are real. Without CUSMA, decades of trade predictability could vanish overnight. Canada and Mexico are no longer reacting, they're preparing. Because when trade becomes a power game, stability becomes strategy. And in this game, survival may depend not on what Trump does next, but on how Canada and Mexico respond together.
The number one American vehicle built and made around the world is the Ford F-Series trucks. They're all aluminum. And they buy it from Quebec. I hit those things and I think, you know what, some of that pressure of the self-inflicted harm that they're doing on the U.S. auto sector is starting to finally bubble up.
After months of escalating trade tensions, August 1st marked another sharp turn. Donald Trump's administration raised tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by the USMCA. And this time, steel took center stage. Steel and aluminum now face a 50% levy, the highest among all sectors. It's not the first tariff Canada has faced under Trump, but it's the most economically disruptive and symbolically aggressive. What's different now isn't just the number, it's the target. Steel isn't a fringe export. It's the backbone of Canada's contribution to North America's auto supply chain. And by striking at this core, Trump isn't just pressuring Canada. He's shaking the very structure of his own industrial base.
It was a tremendous impact. I mean, these are customers and distributors we had been dealing with for many, many years. Unfortunately, the threat of the tariffs was enough to create an uncertain business climate. So our American business evaporated essentially overnight in February.
Canada supplies vast amounts of steel and auto parts to U.S. car makers, from chassis frames to precision components. When tariffs climb, Canadian exporters are often the first to feel the squeeze. The Canadian Auto Parts Manufacturers Association reports that exports to the U.S. have already dropped by 25 to 35%, depending on the company. That's not just numbers. Those are lost contracts, idle factories, and laid-off workers. In Toronto, a manufacturer like Conquest Steel experienced a sharp collapse in its U.S. orders earlier this year, not because of actual tariff enforcement, but because of uncertainty. The fear of policy instability alone was enough to freeze cross-border business. Still, rather than retaliate hastily, many in Canada are pivoting. Companies are refocusing on domestic customers, creating new product lines, and investing in long-term manufacturing capacity. Prime Minister Mark Carney's approach isn't about short-term revenge. It's about structural resilience.
I'm listening to Ford and General Motors, who are pivotal in this, starting to say things like, you're burning all of our profit.
Yet as Canadian suppliers reel from the tariffs, the pain isn't stopping at the border. The shock is rippling straight into Detroit. The U.S. auto industry depends on Canadian steel and aluminum, especially for high-volume vehicles like the Ford F-Series, which relies heavily on aluminum from Quebec. As raw material prices rise, so does the cost of assembly. Automakers can't simply switch suppliers overnight. Industry estimates warn that U.S. vehicle prices could rise by several $1,000s depending on the model, materials, and sourcing, with some projections reaching as high as $9,000 in the most tariff-exposed cases. Trump may be aiming at Canada, but the hit is landing in Michigan. This trade move wasn't born from long-term strategy. It was part of a broader performance. Trump imposed a rigid August 1st deadline and challenged countries to accept bilateral deals, many of them thin on structural substance. Canada refused to follow the pattern. While Japan, Korea, and parts of the EU agreed to expedited deals, Canada held its ground. According to Jean Charest, a senior member of Canada's U.S. Relations Council, many of these agreements are already showing signs of strain. Canada chose not to rush, and for good reason. Carney's government made it clear, a bad deal signed under pressure isn't worth the ink.
If the White House does things that are good for Detroit, they're going to be good for Ontario. The problem is they're aiming at everywhere and hitting us all, and they're going to sink important American companies along the way.
Trump's steel tariffs were meant to punish a neighbor, but the consequences may be greater for his own economy. While Canada is adapting, investing inward, and planning beyond the U.S. market, American automakers are locked into a disrupted supply chain with rising costs and no clear off-ramp. This isn't just a bilateral dispute. It's a test of economic leadership, and as the pressure mounts, it's becoming clear. Canada may be taking the hit, but it's America's industrial base that's absorbing the blow.